Marshalltown Fire Justice campaign calling for criminal charges to be brought against the City of Johannesburg officials who have been accused of failing to enforce bylaws. The St. Diso Commission of Inquiry's report found the city liable for the devastating fire that claimed the lives of at least 76 people in Marshalltown in August last year. The Commission's chair, the former Constitutional Court Judge Sisi Kampepe, released part one of the report yesterday. The second phase of the inquiry begins in July. The report there is expected at the end of August. Nigel Branken is a member of the Marshalltown Fire Justice campaign, a social worker as well, who's been working with the victims since even before this fire. Nigel, good afternoon to you. So the inquiry makes certain recommendations about who action must be taken against. Do you believe the city will actually take that action? Do you think it's really going to happen?
Well, I think, like much that we have to do as we build up into this 2024 election campaign, I think that democracy is really in our hands. We've got to hold the city accountable, and that's why we've formed the Marshalltown Fire Justice Committee. We have many campaigns that we're involved in across the city to fight for housing, to fight for the social compact that we were promised in 1994. If you have a look at the report and you read the report, you see that the city has completely neglected its responsibilities regarding looking after the building, the maintenance of the building, the conditions of the building we're in. And the report goes to the point where it says that primary responsibility for the 76 deaths lies not in the hands of the person who started the fire, but in the conditions that allowed the fire to spread so that it would cause so many people to lose their lives. So, we can't really trust the same city that has allowed this to happen to now hold itself accountable. We, the citizens, have got this role to play in holding them accountable. And that's what our campaign is about.
There's so many things that are going to happen, and I'll talk in a moment about policy, because policy is clearly a big factor here. But there are particularly two individuals that maybe are very interesting. The one is the CEO of the Joburg Property Company, and she knew about the problem. Helen Botha is her name. She knew about the problems, is the finding, and therefore she must personally face action. Do you see the city actually taking action against an individual person? I understand collective responsibility, but that often means no individual is held responsible. It's really a question about the political will of the city to take action against a single person.
Yeah, this is, it really is, this is the story of South Africa. How do we hold these individuals accountable? And I think because we've had collective responsibility all the time, cities just pay out we saw with the Marikana Commission of Inquiry, it took years and years for compensation to be paid towards victims. There's been no prosecutions that have happened, and yet the Commission of Inquiry was very clear that they need to, with its recommendations around prosecutions. And I don't think that the city is going to take responsibility unless we consistently hold this in front of them. There's a responsibility on the media, there's a responsibility on active citizens to hold them responsible. Certainly Helen Botha, her testimony, if you were there on the day or if you go back and watch it, it is all online. It was just her completely denying responsibility, and yet she knew about the conditions in that building from 2019 and just refused to do something. The city completely just handed over they completely neglected the building. They knew it was a fire hazard. They never sent in they never sent in inspectors, and they continued scapegoating. And this narrative of scapegoating the poor, blaming those people who in the city, and even when the fire happened, on the day the fire happened, the city got out, the city's manager got out and spoke about foreigners were to blame. And then we found out later, actually, the building was predominantly occupied by South Africans. Foreigners started the fire. Actually, the fire was started by a South African. We keep looking at who we can scapegoat blame towards, when we've actually appointed a local government. We've got city officials, and they need to be held accountable for what they've done.
So Nigel, I accept all of that, and it's not my job to represent the city of Johannesburg. I do need to ask a question and come at this another way. So in the days after this fire, we here at Newsroom Africa Channel 405 reported on raids on other buildings, and the Joburg Metro Police went to some of the other buildings in that area of Joburg, hijacked buildings. And they weren't actually able to get in. There were people very heavily armed, very difficult situation. You know, the only way really to do it would be to shoot your way in, which no one really wants to do. So I accept the Commission's findings that, for example, Helen Botha must take some responsibility here. But is it really possible for the city to enforce the bylaws that it is supposed to enforce? And we all know, we've all seen, when, you know, they try and go and evict people, try and take action, there's a very big pushback, and often that pushback involves the threat of violence.
Yeah, Stephen, I have to really object to your framing of that question, because it's simply not true that that during those raids that the city couldn't get in. I mean, there's footage all over the internet of those actual raids. And so, for example, if you take the raid of the building in Peterson Street in Hillbrow, Vannon Court, for example, which is probably one of the most dangerous buildings of those buildings. And you see city officials, in fact, you see the city manager walking in with investors into the building and being filmed in the building with investors talking about all of the problems and the crime, and certainly pointing it out. We mustn't forget that the city has a massive police force, and they are able to get into those buildings, and not only from a policing perspective, they should be coming in and working with communities to improve the conditions in the buildings. And when you listen to the testimonies of the victims in this actual building and the stories of the meetings that the people in the building had with the city, so the people in the building went and met with the ward councillors, they went and met with the city officials, they invited them to come in to see the problems in the building. It's simply untrue to say that you know, people would have been prevented from coming in to come in and install fire extinguishers or to come and fix the appliances. That was the narrative that was pushed in the first 4 or 5 days of the Commission of Inquiry. But very quickly, as the Commission of Inquiry went on, we began to see evidence of how the city had actively, completely abandoned the building and not taken efforts. And then they used that excuse that they can't get into the building because the buildings are heavily guarded. And that's simply... I mean, I walk into those buildings, many of those buildings I've walked into myself, and without any guards or, so I don't see how the city with its police force and with its security can't go into a building and inspect it. And I don't see how, if they actually adopted a collaborative approach with buildings, that they couldn't get in. I'm a social worker and I can walk into the buildings. I don't see why a municipality can't get access to the buildings.
And Nigel, since this fire, since the 77 people who died, has anything changed in the other buildings, like the building you've just referred to? Has anything changed? I mean, the city made big promises. In fact, the leaders in other cities and other metros made big promises about hijacked buildings too. I recall eThekwini in particular. Has anything changed in the Joburg CBD? Could what happened, 77 people dying, happen again tonight?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it certainly could happen tonight. And in fact, one only has to look at what's happened to the people who've moved out of the Insadiso building and see how the city's continued to treat them, to see that this has happened to them, in fact, more than 10 times already since the fire. So they were moved to a temporary emergency shelter in Hoffland Park. And then from there, they were treated horrifically there. They were punished. There was collective punishment taking place at that facility. They denied food at times. They switched off electricity at times so that people couldn't cook. And then eventually they came and did mass arrests and moved people to more permanent accommodation in Denver. And you go to this accommodation in Denver, which the city bought for, it's the size of a soccer field, and they bought it for 44 million rand in Denver, in an industrial area in Johannesburg. I mean, you could have got that piece of land for 500,000. You can just see the corruption going into that again. And then from there, we see the city erecting these shacks, and they paid over 68,000 rand for each shack to be put in. And again, the shacks are made of 0.3 millimeter steel that's got chipboard doors. The locks are put on the outside of the shacks. And in those same shacks that those people were moved to, over 200 families, it's been flooded 10 times since they were moved there in November, flooded up to people's knees. So they've lost all of their possessions. They lost all their possessions in the fire, and the city then came in to help them and put them back into those same kind of conditions. So they have faced an emergency again and again and again and again. We've gone to the High Court and tried to get the conditions dealt with in the Denver facility, and there have been some agreements that the city would deal with drainage so the place wouldn't flood. I mean, how can you move people to a facility after a fire disaster and then move them into a place where they're going to be flooded out again? It's just absolutely disgusting. So to answer your question again, what we're doing is we're framing people who are poor and marginalized in the city as the criminals and to blame. And then we say that's their fault and we can treat them however we want to treat them. Actually, we've got to go back to who's responsible for this. We had a promise in 1994 that there would be housing, there would be jobs, there would be education. All of these promises are failing to be delivered because the government is buying facilities like this for 44 million. If you look at the city of Joburg's budget, they spent 968 million rand on building just over 300 shacks. I don't know how you account for that amount, almost R1 billion worth of money being spent on 300 shacks that people get flooded 10 times. I mean, that's horrific. And now you want to say, oh, well, these people are to blame. They won't. Those people are desperate for the city to come and intervene, to come and put electricity in, to put in adequate sanitation. They put in these, I could go on and on. They put in these toilets where women were getting urinary tract infections. The effluent from these toilets that they put in these plastic kind of toilets that they put in, the effluent was evaporating during those hot December months. You'd go past there and the place would just stink. And that's where people had to use their toilets. There's no close by shops, no close by. It's a disaster. This is the disaster the city's created, and this is the disaster the city's continuing to perpetuate. And yes, this kind of disaster can continue to happen until we have a more responsive government. And so the call is to every South African is we've got to begin to get vocal. It's a call is to the media. Stop blaming the poor. Stop framing these issues as it's the poor to blame, and let's actually get involved in holding this government accountable. Yes, we've got to hold the city of Joburg accountable. We've got to hold every official accountable. And we, the people, have got to rise up and begin to create the South Africa that we've dreamed of since 1994.
Nigel, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you. Nigel Brankins, a member of the Marshalltown Fire Justice Campaign. More news in a moment. Stay with us.